would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and their ancestors past and present, and I extend that welcome to all Indigenous people present today. So, in this seminar, we're going to be addressing the topic, Solving Challenges in Regional Australia, Can Localism Work? As you're all aware, Commonwealth politicians are increasingly presenting the concept of localism as the answer to all our wicked problems. For example, the Minister of Regional Australia, Simon Crean, recently declared, "I am a passionate believer in the fact that localism works. Embedding localism is the key to building sustainable communities and turning challenges into competitive advantages." Yet, there remains considerable bewilderment across all levels of government in Australia as to what localism really means in practice. Indeed, a recent survey of Commonwealth departments and agencies identified several approaches to localism coexisting and in competition with one another in the water sector alone. So the purpose of this panel discussion here, this late afternoon, early evening, is to evaluate what localism means in practice. Is it just another form of citizen engagement, or does it represent a new mode of governance for tackling the most difficult problems we are confronting in regional Australia, from climate chaos to economic development? How can localism help generate practical solutions to the problems we are confronting in rural and regional Australia? Does it involve the delegation of decision-making powers and/or delivery functions to the community? Or is it really about informed consultation to legitimate decisions that have already been taken at Commonwealth and state levels? Are we genuinely entering an era of citizen-centric governance in Australia, or is this just populist rhetoric that can only really disappoint and further disconnect Canberra from the Australian citizenry? So, to help us evaluate whether localism is genuinely a big idea with traction or simply empty rhetoric, we have brought together some of the leading international and national thinkers on localism, together with senior practitioners currently engaged in trying to make the concept meaningful in regional policy development, not just in Australia, but also overseas. So our panelists here today include Professor Jerry Stoker. Jerry is the director of the Centre for Citizenship, Globalisation and Governance at the University of Southampton. He's also convener of the ANZSIG Institute for Governance research theme on citizen-centric governance. He's the co-founder of the UK Think Tank of the Year, the New Local Government Network, and is the author of the award-winning book, Making Democracy Work. So welcome, Jerry. We also have Dr. Deirdre Wilcock from Victoria University in Melbourne. Now, Deirdre has been working and researching in the field of public participation, predominantly with Indigenous communities, not just in Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin, but also in Canada and New Zealand for the past 6 years. So she will bring both valuable academic research and practice-based insights to our debate today. We also have Professor Lawrence Pratchett. Lawrence is the Dean of the the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra, but he was also formerly Professor of Local Democracy and a leading thinker on localism in the United Kingdom. And I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to Megan Lancaster. Megan is currently Director of Stakeholder Engagement at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and has a wealth of practical experience in community engagement. Megan's worked at all levels of government, local, state and federal, and as such she has kind of unique perspectives on how different levels of government view their roles in engaging with local communities and the challenges of doing this effectively. So, for example, after the devastating 2009 Victorian bushfires, Megan worked for the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction and Recovery Authority as the Marysville Community Engagement Coordinator. Megan said her job description was to coordinate the community planning process, but in reality, she came face to face with the challenges of local leadership, delegated decision-making, and competing agendas. Megan said she felt extremely privileged to have been given the role and is very thankful to the Marysville community who taught her how much she still has to learn. And in a sense, there's a great maxim that emerges from that this is all about learning. So I think we have an excellent panel to inform our learning in this area. We also call upon our facilitator today, who is Paul Porteous. Paul is visiting faculty at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's also Director of Leadership Development now at the ANZSIG Institute for Governance. And Paul has played an international role in advising on social leadership issues across the world. And indeed, from 2005 to 2009, Paul was Senior Advisor to the President of Madagascar and helped develop the Madagascar Action Plan, developing cutting-edge leadership practice for nation building and the alleviation of poverty. So I will now pass over to Paul to kick off this evening's event.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mark. And it's great to have a panel with such extraordinary expertise from both a practical side, but also in the academic thinking side. And as I was listening to you sort of going through the either, is this good or is it not going to be something that's useful, I kept thinking of that idea of how much process we can actually impose, bureaucracy, procedures, as opposed to actually looking at the real underlying issues and getting something done. And one of the things that I remarked as I talked with each of our panellists beforehand was this notion of localism as being an activity, so a way of thinking rather than some procedure and a 10-point plan that we just tick off on. That idea of competing agendas, competing values, in a sense, is what's at stake. So it's not just a technical process. We're not looking at issues and problems that are simply technical, that we can bring experts in, but saying what are the underlying ones that really we struggle with in communities all around the place. So I thought we might kick off with that thought around localism. What is it? I've been surprised as we put this out on the banner, as in the big headline, everyone was like, oh yeah, what is it? Like, what's that all about? And Jerry has got a tremendous background in all things localism at the moment, but also around politics, governance, and the like. And you've been here for about a week or so on this trip, and I know as we've spoken often and as we think about localism, I couldn't help but reflect that for most of human existence, we've lived locally. So I'm sort of wondering, localism, like what's the sudden discovery? What's special in this? What's the value added in a sense as a concept that can help us with some of these difficult, wicked problems?
Well, Paul, I am incredibly tempted to answer there's nothing new in it, so we all just could go home, really. But if you twist my arm, then I suppose the reality is that we're talking about localism because in different ways people are dissatisfied with governing arrangements. And that's true in many countries, not just in Australia. And the dissatisfaction, I think, is varied. So sometimes it reflects the fact that we now face a whole series of challenges where the spatial scales of government don't seem to kind of fit neatly into the spatial nature of the problems that we're confronting. So if it is an issue around economic development, sometimes it doesn't fit into existing governance structures. If it's an issue around how to manage transport, it doesn't fit into existing governance structures because the nature of those challenges are on a spatial scale and a variety that actually require a range of government actions. And so the debate about localism is about how you get governing to match the complex spatial scales you're trying to deal with. I think another obvious sense in which localism comes to the fore is in many countries there's a sense that decision making is too centralized, so people want to pass power down in order to try and create a better decision making. A third factor, I think, is definitely that in many countries people see that the different arms of government aren't sufficiently integrated, so the different agencies don't work well enough with one another, and localism is sometimes seen as a way of bringing those different agencies together so that they can work with one another. And then finally, and I think probably most importantly, localism is often seen as a way of delivering greater legitimacy in decision making, because if it gives an opportunity to involve citizens directly in decision making, then that might give a sense of support and solidarity behind the ideas that people are actually developing. So I think if we were all satisfied with the way we were being governed, we wouldn't be talking about localism. But because there are problems and challenges in the modern world about the way we are going to be governed, then I think that's why localism's come to the fore.
Great, and I know in the work you've done, you've been trying to almost tease out different forms of localism, and I know we've actually, everyone should have got a copy of a page which you did up, which gave a wonderful sort of reference as to how to look at different forms of localism as strategy, so that, as you say, localism is problem solving in a sense. It wouldn't exist if people were happy. They're not, but they're very different forms of engagement you've written. I mean, looking at some of those distinctions, maybe you can explain them. Some of them seem almost mutually incompatible.
Yeah. I don't know how many Brits there are in the audience, but many of you will be familiar with a children's program called Blue Peter, and they always used to bring out a model that they prepared earlier. You can see a model that I prepared earlier on this sheet of paper. And in the model, what I'm trying to do is distinguish, in a very broad sense, 3 types of localism. And I'm going to try and give you an illustration or an example of each of the 3 types. I mean, the first type is what I call managerial localism. And it's about trying to get an agreement between usually a range of government agencies, sometimes involving other non-governmental partners as well, about how to deliver something locally. And it usually involves giving greater autonomy and greater capacity to local actors, but they have to achieve against a set of targets or a set of assignments given to them by a higher level of government, but negotiated with them as well. The country that's kind of become the past master at delivering that kind of conditional localism is undoubtedly my own country, Great Britain, that has, over the last 20 years, used numerous examples of this. So under the previous government, we had what are called local area agreements, where local authorities negotiated how they were going to deliver certain services, how they were going to work in combination with other agencies, and how they were going to, over a 3 or 4 time period, meet certain targets. The new coalition government has just negotiated a whole series of city deals with all of the major cities in Britain, where they're basically trying to hand out a series of powers to those cities to take over various issues in relation to employment and economic development. But again, it's a kind of conditional form of localism, which is you get these powers, you get these resources as long as you actually deliver. So that's the first type, managerial type. And the second type will be very familiar to you because it's kind of basic representative localism. And the rationale is that what you do is you hand over a set of decisions to elected local government, and they're held to account by their own citizens for those decisions. Now, that kind of localism has been to the forefront of all of the discussions in the post-communist era in Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, many of us over the last 20 or 30 years have been involved in discussions about how you set up systems of elected local government where they previously didn't exist. And in many countries, there are also discussions about the way you tweak that system of elected local government in order to make the elected representatives more accountable, debates about whether you should have elected mayors or other changes like that. So that's a second form of localism. And then I think the third form of localism is what I call community localism, and that's about trying to pass power down to communities and citizens so they can make decisions. And perhaps the most extraordinary example of that is in Brazil, where in the construction of various practices of participatory budgeting, the decisions about the budget of the council has actually been passed down to great ranges of local people, so that different neighbourhoods can join in a conversation about the priorities for spending in their particular communities. So these are the three broad types. So all forms of localism, I think, are about trying to pass power down, and it's just the way in which that passing of power is constructed that is different. In the managerial case, it's largely focused on discussions between intergovernmental agencies, and the passage of power is conditional on achievement of targets. In the case of local government taking on new responsibilities and providing an elected focus for that, it's about whether the local citizens like what the councillors are doing one way or the other. And in the case of passing things down to the community, it's about the capacity and the abilities that the community have to actually respond as well. Now, and this is the final point, which is the point that you've already made, those are all ideal types, the three different types. You can see different practices. The reality is almost all localist strategies involve some kind of mix of those different types. So if you went to France, for example, and you saw the contract de ville, the kind of agreements that were made between different partners in there, that's an example of, I think, managerial localism mixing with representative localism. If you went to France and you looked at, if you went to Sweden and looked at the development of free schools there, where communities have really been put more in charge of some of the schools, but it's also got quite a lot of conditional factors around it. So it's kind of a mixture of managerial and community localism. And from what I've read and seen of the Murray-Darling arrangements, we've got much more of an expert here than me, it does seem to me that in Murray-Darling, in the construction of an attempt to deal with water issues there, there's a kind of combination of both managerial and community strategies. And this is fine, because in the reflection of complex issues, you'd probably want complex strategic responses. But the difficulty is exactly the one that you've identified, which is the success factors around the different kinds of localism are somewhat different. And what works for community localism won't necessarily work for managerial localism. So one of the tensions you have in developing a localist strategy is finding ways of trying to balance out those different factors.
Okay, and so there's a way of thinking about complexity of both the problem and the solution. And often, traditionally, a lot of the focus in government, I suppose, has been around the solution end and saying, okay, what's the best way we can get a solution to this? So there's questions about how and when do you start to engage community. I'm wondering, Deirdre Wilcock, here's these strategies, these three strategies of localism. You're doing an enormous amount of work with Indigenous groups in Australia, around the world. Engaging with groups, Indigenous groups, how helpful does this become? I mean, how do you make that bridge, in a sense, between some of the conceptual stuff of how it might be helpful and the reality of trying to get engagement on the ground and when communities should be engaged?
Well, I think for me, the issue in terms of localism is how you conceive of the word local. And I think the issue lies within, is it a geographical space? Is it reducible to a geographical location? I'm not so sure. I think Jerry's point about extending the idea of localism, I suppose, beyond geographical space and looking at that, complexity of geographical scales. In particular, too, with my experiences with Indigenous groups, I think that's very important. Looking at different assumptions in natural resources management, different assumptions in communicating, I suppose, that the scales of analysis have often been very, the assumptions have been very strong. So there's, local government, state government, federal government. So I am very hesitant to speak on behalf of any Indigenous group, of course, in this, but a lot of comments that I get in my experiences in Canada, Australia, New Zealand is this idea that Aboriginal knowledges or a knowledge can be bounded by the local. So I think that a lot of Aboriginal knowledges around the world, and this is not to say that Aboriginal knowledges are boxed into a corner, is that they're very relational, or very, the local is very much tied to, from the cosmos to the local. So I think, and I bring up this point because I don't know if involving stakeholders other than Indigenous people are that different. I think that the issues are much more broad than a conflation of localism to the local scale. So I think any foray into those kinds of issues need to be necessarily multi-scalar. And obviously...
So what does that mean in practice as well? I mean, as I hear you, you're saying, yeah, I mean, I think of the old phrase where people say, think global, act local. I'm hearing you saying, yeah, think universal almost, act local. There's a connection that goes right along the scale, and there's a distinction in the way people are thinking. So the example you're giving there is structure doesn't necessarily count as much as relationships. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, we can't be thinking, in one moment, all scales at once. But it also can't be conflated as everything's too complex. You can't enter at any point. I think that perhaps one lesson that is really poignant from my own personal learnings from Indigenous groups is that, it doesn't have to be structural locality. It doesn't have to be conflated. Localism local doesn't have to be conflated to a geographical, one town, one street, one something. I think it's really interesting when you start thinking of the local as necessarily a set of relationships or trajectories from the local to the global. It's not a hierarchical locals here, globals here. That it's difficult to walk down the street and not have a global experience, an Indian restaurant on the corner, or it's not that complex. I think that a lot of my experiences with Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous groups, I think that senses of place and why people get involved and that kind of stakeholder engagement, it's very much around a sense of place and care, at least in natural resources management, care about a particular place. And I think that extends beyond, that ethical relationship extends far beyond a geographical location.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about assumptions that people take in stakeholder engagement. What sort of assumptions are the ones that you see that don't work? I mean, clearly we've got governments at all levels coming in saying we want to engage with communities, we want to try and work out what's going on. What assumptions are they bringing that actually act as an obstacle at times in that case?
Well, I think that the assumption that all communities want to be involved may not be always true. I think that there is obviously a lot of historical context when you look at Indigenous. The reason why I look at Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships in this sense is it really does hold a mirror to the natural resources management system as it functions. And I think that there are a lot of interesting cases where Aboriginal groups actually don't want to be involved for particular reasons. There are a lot of assumptions that a lot of Aboriginal groups say, well, we don't want to hang up culture on the door before you enter a room to discuss about environmental negotiations. So I think the assumption that in a meeting room around environmental negotiations that it is necessarily a neutral exercise. And I'm not saying that anyone would get up here and say, no, it's definitely neutral. But I think that it is about different people's values and about negotiating those values.
And are those values generally being discussed in those formats, or is that what you're seeing is missing in a sense? The values are just taken for granted and there's this neutral space people walk into?
I think it's a very complex space. I'm not saying that simplistically that this assumption hasn't been discussed in the past, and I don't think this is anything new. I don't think anyone in this room would say that. But I do think that there are particular assumptions about the way in which local and scale and senses of place and how environmental negotiations are constructed that do serve particular purposes. So I think that needs to be discussed, and those assumptions need to be discussed up front rather than assumed to be implied, or I suppose.
Yeah. And so, and it was interesting, I mean, at the beginning there you were saying often communities don't want engagement. And I'm just wondering, Megan, in your example, your experience as well, I'm wondering, this term engagement, is it sort of going the way of consultation? I mean, we've got communities now that used to be saying, please, I just hope they don't consult us, we don't want to go through this. And I'm just and then we all shifted and said, don't use that, it's a dirty word. We'll use engagement. Yeah. And I'm sort of wondering, is engagement starting to get tainted in the same way of saying, please, I hope they don't come and want to engage, because that takes even longer than the consultation bit.
I think as government bureaucrats, we do have this incredible ability to make the engagement process so painful that people do run. But it's really interesting because Deirdre has thrown a little bit about, I dutifully wrote down my answer, Paul, when you asked me to think about what localism is, and now I've been a bit thrown. But I think to me it's always been, interestingly enough, noting people's real connection to place and their towns. And it was just something that I found amazing after the Victorian bushfires when I started working out in Marysville. And if there's anyone in the audience that has lost family or friends in those devastating fires or any natural disaster, I pay my respects to you, and please don't hesitate to put me in my place if I say anything unrespectful. But it was amazing after the fires, and there was a lot of dialogue in the community about, you shouldn't rebuild in these communities where it was quite obviously such a hazard. And after the fires in the small town of Marysville that was so dependent on tourism, working side by side with people that were determined to rebuild their town against what were some extraordinary odds, is just such a moving experience that I will never forget. And out of that experience, I started to think, I think when we talk about communities, we've in public dialogue, we've had a discussion about Indigenous connection to place and what that means. And through that experience, I was thinking, I don't think we actually talk enough about Australian communities in a broader context and how connected and how much we love where we live. And, move that to the job that I now have at the MDBA. I mean, when we talk about these communities that have very dependent economies based on local irrigation, St George up in the cotton-growing areas in the north, or Griffith in New South Wales. Hello, Alison from Griffith today. People are passionate about these towns that they live in, and I think it's a way of government kind of going, that's amazing social capital. And I would actually counteract a little bit of what you're saying, because my experience is when these people at the core feel whether or not it's new water policy that they may feel is threatening their livelihood, or whether or not that they've lost everything in a natural disaster and they're determined to rebuild their commitment. Governments make shocking mistakes when we don't recognise and value at a very deep level that commitment, because out of that type of commitment and love of their community, there is an amazing wealth of knowledge that we risk if we overlook that, but just this incredible motivation to be involved and make a difference. And to take that example further, one of the things that I witnessed in Marysville, and all of us were part of it as Australian public, was this amazing outpouring of donations. And I remember in the early days, we were in our little demountable building, and it was fantastic because there was all these corporates who were donating, new buildings or new playgrounds, and working with the local community, there was this real desire to accept this overwhelming generosity. But at what point did we try and set up these structures where the community could actually come together at a time when their lives have been shattered and actually be involved in what building went where and what playground went where. And that was an incredibly difficult time, because we were trying to also meet the demands of a public who was saying everyone should be back in their homes by Christmas, let's rebuild the schools. So I think I came out of that experience, and I had the amazing opportunities of 2 years on, I then went up to Queensland to talk to the Queensland government about lessons we learnt in Marysville, and how you do then get this this pressure after a disaster in terms of making sure there's that local voice, or whether or not it's in the job that I have now. People who live in highly irrigated dependent communities, I mean, I've sometimes heard people say, well, is that a vested interest? Is this a voice that shouldn't be in the debate? Should the debate be lifted? This is courageous national water reform agenda, and we need to lift ourselves up and look at what's good for the nation. But whilst I obviously support that argument, what I'm saying is communities who are living, people who are living in these communities, they're passionate about where they live and they want to be a part of the solution. They want to say to us, we know we need to farm with more sustainable irrigated agriculture, but what they bring to the table is an amazing amount of wealth and knowledge. And I suppose so, been a bit long-winded, Paul, and you shut me down a sec. So I suppose for me, localism is about recognising that love of place and then saying, well, how do governments get better at? You know, because traditionally we've kind of had a clumsy approach. How do we get better at harnessing and working with that power and that commitment?
And I think your illustrations really, reinforced this sort of map that Jerry's put out as well. As you said, at times the community, the local farmers, whatever, care deeply about their land. So you've got this sort of community level of localism, and yet there is an imperative at a national level to say, well, we need policies that balance things across. So as Jerry was saying before, there's this sort of intermix. Where does that leave us, Lawrence? I'm wondering, for you, I mean, does Australia, when we think about localism, does Australia need localism or a concept of localism? Is this something that's going to be helpful? When we look at the UK experience and others, it sort of seems as though at times it becomes a disguise for various ideological positions around how to push decisions and responsibilities to local groups and say, well, that's good. We don't have to take the blame for it now. What's the application?
So it depends whether we ask the question, does Australian government need a concept of localism, or does Australia need a concept of localism? Because they're very different things. So it's really interesting listening to Megan and Deirdre and Jerry all talk, and we automatically almost end up with this idea that we can somehow draw on a map smaller local units which become forms of localism. I don't think that's what Deirdre was arguing for, by the way. I think she was arguing very much against that, but we start to automatically think about how can we have something more local. Canberra's a great city for this because, of course, we have the city, we have the north side, the south side, we have Woden, we have Tuggeranong and so on, and then we have all these little communities that have all been defined for us as being communities, and we cross the road from Hughes to Curtin and we go to a different community and so on. And those are great, but they all look the same to me. And they all feel the same. When I first came here 18 months ago, I was shown around and said, these are different suburbs you can live in. And they all look identical to me. They all now feel really different, I should hasten to add. But the reason I'm making this point is that I don't think that the problems that we face, and Jerry makes this point very early on in what he said, that localism is a way of thinking about how we address problems and outcomes, and those problems occur at different spatial levels. So localism isn't about having one single defined idea of what is localism, what is a community. Sometimes it's very easy to identify a community because it has a very homogeneous, coherent identity. But very often, particularly in urban settings, communities are not at one level, they're at various levels, competing levels at the same time. So the challenge, I think, is to think of localism not as one level, but as lots of levels which overlap and come together. So does the Australian government need a concept of localism? Well, I think it does, but first of all, it probably needs a concept of local government. Talking to one of my colleagues, Chris Orlick, earlier on, he was telling me that local government is not actually acknowledged in the Constitution of Australia. It doesn't exist. So immediately we need to think about, does government need to actually just acknowledge these different scales of government that are taking place? But then alongside that, does Australia need to acknowledge localism? Well, I think it already does to some extent. It recognises communities. The discussions I have with people in Canberra all the time are about, why do you live so far away from work? You live 16 minutes away, that's why are you in that different community? And all this. So I think Australia has a concept of localism, but what it doesn't do is pull that concept of localism together into notions of governance, and it's the local governance that really needs to be understood.
And while you're on that sort of ACT theme, in a sense as well. So, ACT is a sort of curious and complex creature, as you said, particularly at first blush. although you seem to have settled down neatly into the machinations of it. What would make, I'm thinking of in practical terms, if you were thinking about localism as a practical tool, what sort of things would contribute to that application in the ACT? Because clearly there's not this local government as such, it's this hybrid thing. Where do concepts like this actually help? I mean, I'm thinking of even for someone who's in government, there's multiple levels, there's often conflicting views, there's the politics on top. How does this help?
Well, localism is all about the extent to which a decision or an action is taken to address a problem that faces a particular spatial or community level problem. So sometimes that's an ACT-wide issue, and sometimes it's much more local than that. I'll give you an example from a UK colleague of mine who has written about problems in a very small community in the city in which she lives, where young people were vandalising and causing a problem, partly in relation to the economic depression going on in the UK at the moment. But the solution that one very local councillor came up with was to find ways of employing local people to actually repair the vandalism that was taking place, and actually therefore getting them to take a sense of pride and sense of place in the locality in which they lived in. That's a very local response to what is a very local problem. There's obviously a much larger problem, which is a significant economic problem in the UK at the moment, and large-scale unemployment and so on. But this is a very local response to a very local problem. So localism can occur in that way, and you can drive around the ACT and you can see different problems in different communities, different opportunities as well, because of course localism is not simply about how do we solve problems, but how do we increase the capacity of our communities to do the things that they want to do. And that can cut across into all sorts of communities. So how would localism work in the ACT? It would mean trying to do things like Jerry talked about in terms of his third category of community, and trying to find ways of encouraging communities to take responsibility for themselves. Clearly, some communities are more capable than others of doing that, so it's actually providing opportunities, but also support for communities to do that.
Now, of course, in doing that, you've often got communities that are saying, well, heck, why should we do that? You know, we're paying for government, we elect them, why should we be doing their job in doing that? I'm wondering, Jerry, I know you've done a lot of work around trust in government. Often we're hearing multi-levels of government, and they say, oh, well, you know, we're the local, but gee, if only that state government would, you know, free up the funds, we could do this. And the state government says, oh, you know, GST money, if only the federal government says, don't blame us, it's all about the states. And does this average citizen, in terms of the research and stuff that's done, really give a toss about intergovernmental relations and different levels of government? In terms of, you know, because if we've got a situation where we're saying, how do we empower local communities to take this on? Are they already jaded with the notion that the government's capable of doing anything? As not anything per se, but anything in terms of addressing some of those problems, given that it's often pointed to as the problem rather than the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is that anyone who's investigated public opinion, let alone their own opinions, is bound to come to the conclusion that there are massive contradictions in that people are often very jaded about government, but equally people are often very demanding of government. And it's one of the characteristics of many of the 21st century democracies that the irony is that government is considered rubbish by most people, but actually people often want government to do more and more. And usually they don't distinguish between levels of government, they just see government and they expect government to act. I think that's not unreasonable on their part, and the only kind of slight caveat that I put to that is that when you do a lot of detailed public opinion work, actually what's really noticeable, especially over the issue of trust, is that people will find it more difficult to trust people that they don't know or organisations that they kind of feel are remote, but actually are much more likely to trust people and organisations that they do know. And generally, that means that local organisations tend to attract slightly higher trust than regional or national organisations, because people feel that they have access to those organisations and people, and they feel that they can understand their concerns because they're slightly closer to them. So I think, in addition to the arguments that we've heard so far about localism partly being powerful because it builds on people's sense of place, I think that if you get localism right, it can actually help restore some of the trust deficit that many of those involved in governing experience, because at a local level people get to know who the local decision makers are, and they begin to feel that they can actually trust them because in some senses they feel they have a relationship with them. It's difficult to trust somebody you don't feel you have any relationship with.
And it sort of builds on Deidre's remark before about relationships becoming so critical in so many different stakeholders, not just Indigenous, but all over the place. I'm wondering, what does that mean then for activists and others? They get involved in local issues. They want to start trying to do things. Localism, for someone, and I'm coming back with a focus on people who are involved in that stakeholder engagement consultation, what's it look like in practice to actually try and build that engagement? After everyone sort of said, please don't engage me, and said, okay, we've got an issue here in a community. Now, we know that often, Megan, you were giving an example before of things that worked well in the bushfire scenario, which were very much locally focused on the community. And yet there's a tendency for people to make policy at a higher level in more remote government offices or in other areas. What in practice does that engagement, thinking about this localism side, what does that look like? I mean, you rock up and you sort of say, hey everyone, we're going to have a meeting, because we've got this, as Deidre was saying, this assumption that if we just get people together and talk to them, that must be good. Yeah. And yet you've got communities and other groups saying, we don't even want to talk to you. Yeah. So what do you do here? What's the practical side of this? You've been there, and I know you saw what worked and what didn't. So.
Yeah. Look, I think the thing that the MDBA, we really learnt the lesson in 2010 is that you can't have an engagement model that is a one-size-fits-all. So there's been lots of, public dialogue about this, and, hundreds of centimetres of columns written about in 2010 when our approach was just to go out and have public meetings, the same public meeting in every town, no matter which town it was, that just didn't work. So in 2012, 2011, when we went out this year, it was like, back to this issue about do people want to be engaged, it's about their sense of whether or not this is a problem for them. And if people generally think this is a problem for us, they want to be involved. They want to come together and be part of the solution. So in these communities like Deniliquin or Goolwa in South Australia, these people are desperate, they want to be in part of this conversation. So the model there has to be, we have to be talking to them all the time. We have to be speaking with them regularly, we have to be go out and visiting them. It just has to be a whole range of mechanisms so that it's an ongoing conversation. And you're actually building trust, and you're kind of actually building some sort of way to work together to come up with a solution, because that's ultimately what people want to do, is become part of the solution. And now in a town like, I'll pick a town in the Murray-Darling Basin that probably doesn't see that their economy is dependent on the irrigation, then you know what? A public hall meeting in that town's probably fine, because people are probably happy just to come along and have some information. So maybe that goes to the heart of this issue that we're talking about, which is this kind of sense of people's involvement in the problem. And I suppose harking back to my days in a disaster, when people have lost everything, then it's never a case of wanting to be involved because they're there. So what does it also look like? I think trust is a big one, and it's not just about trust between the government and the community, however that ends up being defined in whatever the situation is, because sometimes community can be the scientists, or it can be the industry, or whatever your scenario is. But in the bushfire thing, when I look at this sliding scale here we have of managerial representative community, there was some really courageous decisions made early on when there was all the money donated through the Red Cross, and there was a decision that 80% of that money would go directly to individuals. So that was just the role of the Red Cross to put that money out. And there was a really courageous decision early on that 20% of that money, which was a lot of money, 20% of 370 million, would actually go direct to community projects. big issue there. Who makes the decision about which community projects get what money and how much money? So I'd like to think that what we did in Victoria was quite a groundbreaking model, where we actually went out and said, in these 33 communities across Victoria, we actually did set up a process where communities would come together and they would actually be told they'd have a pot of money for their town, and then they would be involved in deciding how to divvy that money up. So when you ask me what does that look like, that's a very different thing, because you've then got all these issues that are very small community, and I think we've already touched on leadership. When you actually do throw the doors open and go, now as a community you decide, and in Marysville, how do you want to spend $6 million? You're in a very different scenario, and issues of trust then comes up between the community, and really fascinating issues there of, well, who in a community has the legitimacy to talk on behalf of their whole community. And I think, I really hold battle scars deep to my heart when government sometimes can do a really good job of guiding that stuff really well. And we can do a great job in supporting and providing the structures to help people make these decisions and build their capacity. But when we do it badly, we actually end up in some small communities making the divisions worse and playing a bad role where communities get pitted against each other. So that's the stuff that I kind of am very passionate in terms of going, we need to build our knowledge here of how we become enablers without becoming bureaucratic where people just don't want to talk to the engagement staff, but how you actually build these processes that when someone comes at the end of the process, they go, that was a great process, and where do I sign up for the next one? And don't come out going, at a local councillor level, we ended up just fighting and everyone hated going to the meetings.
Yeah, and you often hear of the activists, those who volunteered, getting burnt out and
Yes.
saying, heck, all I did was go to endless meetings, nothing ever actually happened, and at the end, I got blamed for everything in the community as well. So yeah, thanks guys, yeah, see you again later. So those risks are there if it's not done well. But I think you've painted a really good picture of how that engagement can happen from the beginning. I'm wondering, Deidre, at the beginning you were talking about problems, almost engaging community activists in the problem, almost the problem definition right up front, rather than this sense of, okay, we've decided what the problem is, now we go out and start engaging about solutions. Do you want to reflect on some of the practical sides of what that looks like, to actually engage with the community, to say, okay, we've actually got a dilemma here, rather than we've decided what the dilemma is and now we're just going to talk about what the solution might be? Maybe draw that out.
Yeah, I don't think it's that different in terms of consultation or informing communities and that kind of argument for Indigenous communities than anybody else, really. I think that a number of assumptions exist within an environmental decision-making program at any state and government in Australia, and I think that those assumptions of what consultation model or what consultation would look like should be up front. So in my case, exactly what Megan was saying, like it's very important to have a very contextual approach to understanding the place in which you're going before you go. Like it is, at least with Indigenous communities, it's really important who you meet first and how that's seen and all of the politics there. But I think in general, in terms of involving communities, I think it's really important to have the assumptions. Well, this is what natural resources management has been historically. This is the historical context of where that's come from with Indigenous communities. A lot of Indigenous people that I've talked to, it's not that difficult to get a conversation going if that consultation is taken carefully and with trust. So I remain optimistic about if those assumptions are made explicit. I'm not saying that process will necessarily lead to an outcome that is productive in all senses, but having those assumptions out in the open first is one way of building that trust up front.
Why are those conversations so difficult then? You're sort of saying, look, it's not that hard. You can say right at the beginning, here's what's going on. But yet that's almost countercultural to many of our larger organisations and institutions. I mean, I'd be interested from you guys, what sort of resistance or obstacles do you face even within your own organisations or ones you've worked with when you actually try and say, hey, let's look at this in a different way than how we've dealt with it before?
I guess, can I just start?
Please.
I guess in a lot of circumstances that the assumption, I suppose, the implication of talking about philosophies or values has been really undermined. So I think that this, for a lot of Indigenous communities, has saying up front, okay, that the natural resources management system is founded upon a separation of humans and nature. Like even at that philosophical level, that natural resources management is founded upon that kind of separation. It's not theological, really. It's not pie in the sky kind of stuff. I think that those kinds of conversations need to start from a basis where, where place is discussed. It's not just an Indigenous issue. Place is necessarily the connection between people and how they feel about a place. Like, you speak to any kind of, farmer that's lived in a place for a while, it's not rocket science, really. That connection between, that assumption is one, I suppose, of a list of things.
That you could explore. Megan, it sounds obvious, and yet, we see, particularly, I suppose, at senior levels in government, many people have staked their careers and their promotions on a particular model of engagement, consultation, that's often termed around how do we manage expectations? How do we be careful not to let the genie out of the bottle by saying to people, yeah, you might be involved in a decision. And everyone's like, oh, great, hang on. That's dangerous, try and push it back. What's the culture that happens inside organisations? When you say, in your case, stakeholder engagement, and you say, hey, I've got a great idea, let's open this up to the community, have the sorts of discussions Deirdre's talking about. What sort of response do you get?
Okay. Look, I think it is very difficult stuff, and I think it depends on in what context are we talking about. So what decisions here are we really actually saying we're going to share the decision making? Because, so a debate we're having at the moment is it's kind of, I think it's about the value of local knowledge and the kind of people that just kind of know and feel, as opposed to sort of more academic, years that you've built up. And I think you're getting me in trouble here. I don't want to answer this question.
Talk about the Victorian bushfires.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think the Victorian bushfires is easier. So how do you take, we had some amazing architects who were world-leading architects who came to us and said, we want to donate our skills. So how do you have that conversation that says, you've designed a really beautiful building, but you know what, we've really got to talk to the local community about this. And the amazing architect says, but I can tell you I've studied for 15 years, I don't really understand. But, watching that sort of magic happen, though, when the architect then does sit down with the community and they start saying, well, it's a beautiful building, but, that door is actually where we take the kids, and, that doesn't actually work because beside us is going to be the Boy Scouts, and actually the Boy Scouts don't really like the playgroup. There's an old feud there, and that's why this isn't going to work. So for me, the most moving times in my career is where you actually see that stuff happen, where you take someone who's a leader in their field, not really understand when you try and talk to them as the engagement staff member about the value, and then when you watch them kind of go, oh yeah, I can see why the design of that building. And if I can make it maybe more contextual to what I'm working at the moment, I think our socio-economic modelling work is a really good example. So we have some of the most talented economists working with us at the moment. We're very fortunate to have that. But how do you sort of say, okay, well, we've done the modelling here, but we do go to communities who keep saying, well, we live in the community and we don't think what you're telling us matches. So I think it is courageous of government to go, well, okay, there needs to be a conversation. So why are the world leaders here telling us one thing and you're saying you live here and you don't think another? So then I think that's where you do have to have the courage to talk about assumptions and open the door. But it's not easy stuff. And anyone who would have worked with the Victorian Bushfire Authority, and we went through that model of, which was fabulous ideas in the early day, which was take a couple of $1 million and set up a model where communities start making decisions on how to spend that money. It was some tough times there where the community would come forward with projects that the policyholders at the Red Cross would say, well, that project you've proposed is not in line with the donor intent. Now, that's a really difficult question. Who donated money after the Victorian bushfires? What was your intent? And an example coming out of Marysville was we had projects heavily backed by the local community that was saying, we need to get tourism back up and running and we need to fund some local businesses. But when we took that to the Red Cross, they were saying, we're not here to fund small business. This is money that was donated by the Australian. So I think it's just about never underestimating the complexity of, if you are government and you do want a model that you're devolving decision making, how are you going to keep the conversation moving? Because you're ultimately going to get to points where, like any negotiation, you're going to have to move through some difficult issues. So I think that is why sometimes it is quite scary of government to kind of invest and have the courage to move down this type of path.
That's great, thanks. Lawrence?
Well, I just wanted to come back on some of that because I think the conversation we're drifting back into is the idea that government's going to do localism, that it's going to, it does things to communities and so it will allow an engagement. I understand where you're coming from, so I'm not critical of your specific comments, but I want us to think about moving beyond that. The communities have or people have a natural ability to self-govern. Not always in ways that are democratic. You know, we can think of mafia, we can think of drug gangs and so on. But you know, Lord of the Flies is a classic example of self-government. Yeah, yes. It's highly democratic the way I run business, government, and law. Yeah, but. There is a capacity amongst all of us to self-govern. If we split up into groups now to go for dinner, we'll self-govern ourselves and so on. So I think the connection between government and community shouldn't be about how do we engage, but how do we actually facilitate self-government within sets of criteria, democratic criteria that we want to achieve, to actually allow self-government to take place. And therefore, that's what I understand by localism. So I think much of what you're trying to do, Megan, is part of that. But we have to get away from, when you said, does Australia need this concept of localism, it's got to go away from the mindset that government has to create localism and rather create the facilities or the capacity in which communities can develop self-governance in a way that is fitting for them and then find their own ways of connecting with government in ways that make sense to them. So it's as much about what the communities want to do as what the government wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Great clarification, and an important one though that requires a certain level of letting go, not just by government, but you know, we go back to, as Deidre was saying, assumptions about how we make decisions in Australia, assumptions about the relationship between government, different levels of government and people. So what you're proposing, you think, yeah, that sounds really great, and yet we're also hearing there's a lot of resistance to that, where you know, government's going to say, well, they do play a role, and they're not wanting to let go. Jerry, I'm just wondering, I mean, your model sort of on one hand has the community part of it, which very much fits into what Lawrence is saying, the community takes up that. But you've also got this other side, which sort of lends more to some of the earlier discussions around the managerial, top-down, where the government will tell you what to do, and also that representational one of, well, we've elected these people, they've got to sort it out. Listening to some of those practical examples and in light of Lawrence's comments, how's that fit in terms then with your model? Does that help, you know, does your model still help clarify the type of action that can be taken within communities to use, you know, in a sense, localism as a way of making progress on issues?
Well, I mean, I hope it does, and I think the main way it can help to clarify is by pointing out that it's virtually impossible to imagine any situation where all three versions of localism wouldn't be in play, because even a full-blown community form of localism still has to have some sense of decisions that would be taken elsewhere, decisions taken at another level, etc. And I think an additional complexity in all of this is that everyone in this room has at least two conceptions of democracy in their heads. And they probably have more, but they have at least two. The first is the sense that it's a kind of consumer version of democracy, which is that you should have a democracy where people should get what they want. So when you ask community groups initially what they want, they're likely to say a whole series of things that are their immediate interests or concerns. But actually, everyone has another conception of democracy, which is somehow or other, somebody should be making decisions in the public interest, or in the general interest, or in the interest of the long term, in the interest of communities that aren't born yet, in the interest of various requirements in terms of ecology. There's all kinds of other general ways in which people think democracy should work as well. And part of the attraction for me still of a localist strategy is it does enable you to reconcile those two forms of democracy, that you give people a chance to have a voice and express their immediate concerns. But if you create the right institutional structures, you can also encourage them to present their ideas and think about their ideas as they are trying to claim a general interest or a public interest for what they're doing. And ultimately, it seems to me the best debates in democracy are those where people are prepared to move onto that terrain of saying, this isn't about what I can get out of it, it is about making the right decision in the general or the public interest. And I agree with Lawrence that people are capable of doing that, but I think that it's important that, I'm not sure it's governed, but I think it's important that there is an infrastructure that enables them to get to that position, and that does require institutions, it does require support. After all, I don't know what you think about professionals at it, elected politicians, but occasionally we think that maybe they focus a little bit too much on sectional interests and not enough on the public interest. I don't know whether you have that criticism in Australia, but occasionally it's mentioned in Britain. And we know that Parliament is constructed, a lot of political institutions are constructed precisely to try and encourage people to focus on the public interest. Well, we can't all of a sudden expect communities to magic that up if the professionals can't do it. So I think that we need to recognise that it does need to be structured, and there need to be institutions, and there does need to be support for them to be prepared to take that step to think about it in terms of making decisions in the public interest, rather than just simply saying, I want. I mean, there's no point in a democracy where everyone just says, I want, because might as well just have a market. Why have a democracy? The whole point about collective decision-making is that we actually share gains and losses.
I think also, Paul, I think the point that's coming out for me in both of these comments is it really is ultimately comes down to informed decision-making. So no one's ever going to make a decision if they're not properly informed. So I suppose back to my example of the architect. Undoubtedly, the architect is much more informed about, you know, they've studied for 8 years, but I think it's about, so I think it is naive to go, we've got these really difficult issues or these wicked policy problems, so the answer is you just throw the doors open and ask the community what they think. And I think the thread which is building, Jared, what you're saying, it really just keeps going back to informed decision making. So if we are going to take these steps that says we need to get local and new information from communities into our decision making as you know, government bureaucrats, then we need to set up ways of making sure that we can bring them along for the journey and we respect the information they're bringing to the table, but we're also increasing their capacity to also increase their knowledge of an issue. So I think for me, the point you're pulling out there is that it really comes down to who's informed and who's making the decisions, and therefore what's influencing the decisions that are being made.
That's great, thank you. Okay, let's have some questions to the panel, please. We've got an opportunity for...
I'll start with a statement. Nothing I've heard tonight convinces me that it's worth adding the ism. Sorry, nothing I've heard tonight convinces me that it's worth adding the ism to local. But mind you, I don't think it's worth adding the ism to national either or global, so it's not local alone. So that's my comment. But my question comes down to not this view. I've heard a lot of, I'll try to summarise, but a lot of what I would call sort of instrumental decision making about better processes for local involvement in decisions or structures in society. And what interests me most, my question is directed to Deirdre about the Indigenous view. I did some consultation on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan with New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, very clearly defined. Here's the problem, the plan, we'd like to consult with you, an interest group. And they said our first point, and I'll summarise, is we don't think the state of New South Wales taking our water was a legitimate act. We don't agree with it. It is still our water. Now, to me, that's the sort of negotiations you were talking about, where you've actually got to stand back and allow those underlying assumptions to come through. But mind you, that proved to be an almost useless strategy in terms of influencing the plan. So I try to open to anybody and say, how do we deal with the fact we're living in this incredibly complex world with highly contested views about not only what is important, but what's legitimate and how decisions should be made.
Great, thanks. Do you want to grab it?
Can I respond just quickly? I think that the assumption that, first of all, I think that the assumption is very common that consensus will be built through these kinds of processes, and I think starting from very, very early on, that consensus is rare, if not ever, possible. That's just an initial comment, but does anybody else want to?
Well, I think it is incredibly hard to construct a dialogue if people don't accept that they're in a dialogue. And in a way, your statement indicates that at least one party didn't think that it was a legitimate dialogue to be having. And if that's the case, it is incredibly difficult to imagine constructing a dialogue. It's an issue that is confronted in other parts of the world as well, and probably is the most significant and intractable governance problem that any set of political institutions face. And the time-honoured way of dealing with it is time. You just wait.
Happy to have a dialogue, but not on a predetermined set of assumptions. I think there's a big difference. So,
yeah, well, it's difficult to imagine having a dialogue without any assumptions.
I think the important thing for that kind of dialogue is for it to be what I was trying to explain before. It was trying to be situated. So this kind of push, obviously sort of wider push for outcome-driven models, I think for a lot of Indigenous groups and for a lot of people, that kind of situated dialogue is important for itself. And I think obviously that decision has to be made, but I think that dialogue is undervalued.
I mean, it sort of strikes me as you speak that, as you said, there's these deeper underlying background issues. And that wasn't the purpose of what was trying to be discussed. I mean, these are issues we've failed to deal with and failed to engage with at a national level, at a much deeper level to make progress on. And I think what so often happens as I listen to you is that we say, oh, well, don't deal with that as a bigger issue. But we'll have something smaller, as you said, situated, contained, and we say, look, can we just talk about this bit? And people are saying, well, no, we don't recognise that. And so I think the challenge from a leadership point of view is how do we actually raise those bigger adaptive issues? And I'm curious in the sense, as I listen to the localism thing, of saying, is that a way to start at least getting a dialogue going that we seem quite incapable of having quite often at a larger national level? Question mark, that's all. Just a thought. I think it was a great comment. Other thoughts? Sorry, I think you had your hand up first. And then you.
Hi, I just wanted to build on Jason's question because I actually think at the heart of what he was saying is, I mean, if you look at the topic, it's solving challenges in regional Australia. Can localism work? What we're saying is, when does the conversation start? And how do we start the conversation? And the temporal scale, I didn't think we were getting into enough, because I think that's one of the challenges, which is that, yes, we're looking for localism to resolve it in our timescale, when the issue that Jason just mentioned is actually a timescale that is beyond government. So I'm just interested in any comments on that.
Maybe
Lawrence.
I can talk with the sort of ignorance of somebody that doesn't really know the context of this question. So, but it does strike me that immediately what the two of you have learned from this is something that you probably hadn't anticipated at the start of the process when you were getting involved in these conversations. But it also strikes me then that maybe these communities, whilst it won't resolve in the timescale that you wanted, you are probably triggering a conversation with them in their communities, and building therefore the sense of community and the sense of capacity to maybe start to respond to some of the challenges which without engaging with them wouldn't have happened. So I think there are things you can take from this and learn from it. It's not a great answer to the problem, but it is a start of a process, I think, which is maybe, from what I gathered from the Maritime Basin in particular, is long overdue. I think it's a potential solution from the problem that you've identified.
Any other
I'm always an optimist. So.
Any other comments?
I think that the other thing I'd sort of say is I think it's back to the point I think I was saying before about it's about what do we think the problem is as the government policy officer, and then what does the people that we're having a conversation with think the problem is. So too often in government, you know, we work in our sort of functional areas, and that's the structures that we exist. So you know, you might be from the Department of Regional Australia and you're going to a community and you want to talk about, you actually probably have quite a narrow thing that you've been set up to consult with, but the community in front of you, and especially to Jason's problem, we're going, well, we don't want to talk about you're defining the problem this way. We see this as the problem. And for me, that's about, well, they'll come to the table if you want to talk about what they really want to talk about. And that's where they're engaged, have a conversation. And I think the biggest challenge for governments is because we do operate in functional areas, when it does come to really big issues, and we do want to kind of engage in a real conversation, how do we broaden it? And I think the other thing to that point is, I suppose the other thing about this kind of concept that gets talked about more about place-based engagement means that government has to move to a way where we can do that. So if you are a federal government and you want to engage in one community, you can't just go out and talk about one part of our business. We have to, and we're working on it, but we need to get there, develop a way where we go to that community, we actually understand that it's a holistic, difficult issue. And when we come to have that conversation with them, we're actually equipped to discuss the full problem. Because you're right, there's that disconnect where, you know, if they're like, well, if you just want to talk about this aspect of our economic issue or our environmental issue or whatever it is, and you're just wearing your one policy hat, people don't want to engage and they want to walk away from the table.
And I think that needs to be contextualised as well. So the assumption that issue is going to be solved on that day at that time, I think that there is like more of a strategic direction through understanding that multi-scalar, both temporal and spatial. So I think it is working towards that in a contextualised approach. Does that make sense?
Okay, there was a comment down here. Oh, sorry, yeah, you were going to.
Just a question for Professor Stoker. You spoke earlier about some examples from Brazil and Sweden, and I'm just curious about some of the practicalities of how those projects or initiatives came about, and how did they gain traction? Did they originate from government, from community, or some cosmic confluence? How did this happen?
I mean, obviously the last. I mean, the answer is different in both cases. The participatory budgeting really emerged as part of a strategy to cement democratic politics in various Brazilian cities, and there was a kind of in the process of democratization, many community groups and community movements had played a big role in encouraging the spread of democracy. But there was a political system where the parties kind of largely excluded them from decision making once the democracy was up and running. So actually participatory budgeting was a way of reconnecting political leaders with neighbourhood activists and neighbourhood campaigners. And it then became a way of actually bringing in large numbers of people in the decision making process. And it actually tried explicitly to develop this sense of getting people to make a judgment on the public interest. So although you could put forward the interests and concerns of your neighbourhoods, actually the ultimate decision was all of the different neighbourhoods voting on the priorities of the whole range of neighbourhoods across the city. So they actually had to come to a judgment whether their needs were actually greater than other communities' needs. And what it showed was over a period of time, 5-10 years, there were many, literally thousands of people that could be drawn into a process where they made those kind of decisions in the public interest. So the motivation in that case, I think, was about re-cementing the relationship between the drivers of democracy and the practices of democracy. In the case of Sweden, it was, they have an incredibly strong local government system already, and they have a lot of strong local decision making, but I think there was a feeling that there were resources and capacities in their communities that they weren't fully utilising, and the free schools would give them an opportunity to get parents and others that were really engaged in education, much more involved in decision making and in the development of schools. So it was seen as a way of kind of really adding on an extra community dimension to what was already quite a highly localized system. So a kind of slightly different motivation reflecting the different situation in Sweden.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks. Deb Kerr from the National Farmers Federation, and obviously I've been quite involved with the Basin Plan, but I want to pick up on a point that was made very early on. I think, Paul, you may have even made it in some of the opening comments about the complexity that we're dealing with local issues in localism, and local government in particular has been talked about a lot today. But I reflect on, well, we've got local government, we've got regional organisations of councils, we've got regional NRM bodies dealing with the environment, we've got regional Develop Australia dealing with the economic issues in regional Australia, got local councils, you've got bodies being set up, by the authority to deal with localism, if you like. Can we be a bit smarter about what we do? Could the panel sort of reflect on that? And obviously some of those have significant costs in establishment, structures, operating. They're still consulting with the same groups of people, but can we be smarter about how we deal with local communities and making it a bit easier and stop some of this burnout?
Silence, love.
I'll have a go again.
After you.
I'll have a go. I'm not sure we can be smarter, but within Europe there's been a big discussion around multi-level governance, and that comes from the understanding that there are not just a hierarchy of government bodies, but also a range of different governance bodies involved in governing any community. And one of the things that comes out of the multi-level governance literature, which I think is quite interesting, is the notion that we could map the same bodies in the same places, more or less, different councils maybe, different community organisations and so on, but really it's more or less the same. But the way in which they engage is very different in different places. So what multi-level governance creates is a space for communities to actually shape their own sense of destiny, their own sense of place, and so on, within a complex governing arrangement. So if we're going to get smart around that, we need to create the opportunities to institutionalise what is an opportunity for communities, rather than try and impose a single set of governance structures on them. And that means empowering those communities to take control. Because I come from a very strong local government background, I suppose I see local government as being at the heart of anything that might happen. But that does mean that you've got to have good local government, and I do know that people in Australia are quite critical of the capacity of local government to do that.
I mean, I'll just quickly add that the most inefficient form of government may be incredibly streamlined, incredibly small, focused or strategic, etc. But if it's not actually engaged with the issues that people care about, it's not efficient, it's useless. So there's a different understanding, I think, of what efficiency is within the context of democracy, which is, does it actually deliver a form of engagement which enables people to make decisions in the public interest? Now, given the complexity of many of the issues that we confront, I don't think it's surprising that whenever, and it's not just true in Australia, it's true when you look over the world. All over the world, people keep on saying, are our governing structures the right structures? They always say, no, they aren't. Then they have a conversation saying, well, shall we change them? And they say, oh, well, that's too much flipping effort. And then they say, well, what can we do to construct kind of plasters to go over the fact that the structures don't work? And in a way, I still think that incremental response is the right response, because unless there's people here that are actually convinced that reorganisations bring huge benefits, which we all enjoy for years and years, and they would have to produce fantastic evidence to convince me, then in a way, I think we are left with nothing other than trying to find new solutions to the complexity of spatial scales, the complexity of the problems that people confront. Now, I agree, it gets a bit frustrating when there's then a mass proliferation of those. So you certainly would like to imagine that there could be some streamlined thinking about how many of those to have. But honestly, I don't think you could travel around the world and not find people trying to stick these new institutions somewhere into the system, because it's just an inherent part of the incredible complexity of governing in the modern world.
Take that to its conclusion, start thinking, wow, where can I put the next Band-Aid plaster on? And,
I think another simple intervention, in my experience, and this is probably a very naive comment, is the turnover of stakeholder engagers, I suppose. In local government, I know for a lot of communities, it is very, very difficult if, it is about relationships and trust-based relationships. A lot of Indigenous communities really struggle with the high turnover of people. So I think a very simple intervention into that. I don't know. This might be a very naive comment to say, and I know that there are very serious realities over restructuring and all those things, which I have experience over too. But building those relationships, I think that's really undervalued. And I think that those relationships with those individuals and the trust base that comes with that is very undervalued as well.
And I think, Deb, thank you for bringing that point up, because it's such a delicate balance here with the scales, isn't it? So how do we take, something that Lawrence has also referred to, which is we know that you can't have a one-size-all-fits approach, and we know that for an issue like the Murray-Darling and Basin Authority, we're engaging across 4 states, which have 4 different state government leaders, and then how do we adopt a model that is intuitive and respectful and picks up the nuances and the value of that local knowledge. And I suppose the only thing I can do is reflect. It's really funny, when I started my little humble career in Griffith City Council at a local council, I remember thinking, whoa, this is really overwhelming. I've got to engage with the CWA and I've got to engage with the councillors, and it's a really complex web. And then I grew up a little bit and I moved to state government, and then I suddenly got a job where definitely when we set up the Victorian model and then I went to Queensland, the Victorian model was that we would engage directly with those really affected communities, and we made decisions that local government would be involved in that model, but we would drive it. And when I went to Queensland, the discussion on the engagement strategy there was the Queensland government said, no, what we're going to do is the local governments under the Emergency Management Recovery Act, that they will do the engaging, and then the state government will kind of leverage off the systems they set up. So there you have a dilemma. So when state government set up the recovery model, you have resources, you have the ability to get the big people like Christine Nixon and all the powerful players in there, and you're running the process, so you can get those outcomes out that you need. But if you go through the local government model, so for me, I thought there was pros and cons of, does state government just entrust local government, recognise that there's lots of capabilities, but state government's job is just to say, but local government doesn't have any resources as us, it may not have the ability to manoeuvre, so we need to build their capacity. And then I've grown up a little bit and somehow got myself a job at federal government, and suddenly I'm in a job which says, well, how do we, on this contentious issue, is it our job as federal government to say, the states actually have the role here to do our engaging, and what we need to do is just work with the states. But in our world, where we've got state premiers of different colours, red and blue, if we had a model that just completely relied on them to do the engagement, how effective would we be in getting information we believe is necessary out and that information back? So I'm on board with you there, Deb. How do we get the balance right between a model that is respectful to the fact that each state, community, network all have a different way of operating, and we respect that and we leverage off what's already existing, but what point do we have to go on nationwide agendas such as this one? You need to put in some structures that are going to work for this issue.
Great, thanks.
Firstly, thanks to all the panel. It's been a terrific discussion. Just want to change tack a little bit, and I've been thinking a lot about the impact that mining has on regional Australia and on local communities and place, and I'd be interested in comment on that, particularly because the decision making is often not with the federal government or even the state government, and it can have a major impact on the shape of a community, and in fact even whether small towns even exist. And we've done some work at the Australian Centre of Excellence on Fly In, Fly Out, for example, huge impact. So I'd just be interested in, perhaps some reflections on that from the panel.
Not not looking to me to go first again, are you?
He comes from Buxton, which is a well-known mining community. Not.
Sorry, I missed the question. I heard the fly-in, fly-out aspect, but I missed the first part of the story, the question.
Well, really the question is whether how much local communities can make a difference to the shape of the future in light of the sort of, mining companies responsible to shareholders primarily. What can be done to ensure what you want for your community in that context?
Yeah, and I mean, in a sense, there's a discussion that goes around saying there are extraordinary vested interests, extremely powerful people sitting around the boardrooms and others. How does a small community say, hang on, we've got a different interest here. What do we do against those huge vested interests?
I am quite interested at the moment, just I guess a comment. This Lock the Gate movement is interesting me at the moment. It's a group of people signing on and basically just locking the gate and stopping for those who haven't heard. I find this political movement really interesting in the way that, for someone that's quite interested in social movements theory, that a group of people can intervene in that kind of issue from across the political spectrum, and to be able to agree on an issue is it's intriguing to me anyway. I suppose that's one intervention anyway, so, of not wanting to participate at all. And how this could happen, I haven't seen it in any other nation.
Yeah, I think to that point I always find really interesting, I've had a little bit of exposure and conversation with people who work in the mining industry and are engagement people there, and I suppose there's this really fundamental question about where is the engagement coming from? Is it coming from a PR place in a big company like mining that just needs to tick a few boxes so that they can get in there and mine the land? Or is it coming from a more genuine thing which is coming from a philanthropic, no, we should be good corporate citizens and we're engaging because so I think that sometimes goes to the heart of it, and then the balance then is that, how do people find the actual power that they have? But
No.
So we're losing optimism at a great rate here, courtesy of the mining industry. But I mean, your point gets to the heart, though. I suppose it's a more general, bigger issue, and localism is a part of this. Jerry, you've put your different schemas and strategies. One of those is about the powers of representative government and the powers of people who are there as opposed to the community, and even government managerially. But there's still, as you've said, there's certain power structures that exist that are a reality. That decisions are going to be made in particular vested interests, that communities might not feel in a position to be able to push back against such strong vested interests. Is there parts of localism that can actually help with that strengthening? I was really conscious when you answered that question around Brazil, where you were saying, well, actually, multiple local communities get together, start looking at, well, what are the priorities? And the key point you said was they decide and think about what's in the public interest, what's the public value at stake, rather than just, hey, what's in it for me? Is there something about that collective idea of getting communities together that can somehow act as a pushback against these obstacles you're raising of powerful vested interests just saying, out of the way, we're here?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is yes, and you can see it across the world. I mean, I don't doubt the power of vested interests, and particularly the power of mining companies, on the grounds that, as far as I understand, a lot of the Australian economy seems to be built on that capacity within the economy itself. But the biggest enemy of anything is fatalism, just simply accepting that things have to be as they are. And what's amazing is that human beings in various localities up and down the world constantly show you don't have to accept things as they are and you can change them. And I'll give you one of my favourite examples simply because it happens to be my favourite city in England, which is Manchester. And 30 years ago, Manchester could have easily accepted that it was finished as a city. It had lost virtually all of its manufacturing capacity. It suffered the most incredible economic decline. And a group of people who call themselves nothing other than Mancunians actually committed themselves to try and work to completely change the economic structure, the capacity, the finances, the cultural understanding of the city. And over a period of 30 years, they've effectively done that. And I think created a city that isn't free of problems and isn't free of difficulties, but is now vibrant, is seen as a city that is actually going places. They didn't say it seems impossible. They actually used the power of place. Their most powerful motivation was they didn't care whether you were left-wing or right-wing. The reality is were you a Mancunian or were you not a Mancunian. And they used that ideology very powerfully to actually help drive a genuine economic development. Well, you can actually tell that story in literally thousands of other places, and I don't think that we should let too much negativity or fatalism get in the way of what it is that people can do when they combine. But of course they were making decisions not for the short term, they were making decisions for the long term and for the future of different generations within Manchester, and it proved a very successful strategy.
Fantastic. Okay, well, it's time. So I want to say thank you to our panellists for engaging.